Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Ellen Bork. I am the Director of Democracy and Human Rights at the Foreign Policy Initiative, a proud co-sponsor with my fellow groups of this great occasion. I'm very impressed to see all of you here today, and I think it testifies to the interest in U.S.-Russia relations, in democracy and human rights in Russia, and also the possibility of bringing about change through collaborating and working in support of Democrats in Russia. We're extremely honored to have Senator Ben Cardin here today, who needs no introduction, but I would like to at least express my gratitude to him for his leadership, not only in bringing about the Magnitsky Bill, which of course is named in honor of a real hero of Russian rule of law, to thank Senator Cardin for doing that, and for continuing, and I would say even reviving, a strong tradition of congressional activism in human rights and democracy in American foreign policy. Senator Cardin, thank you very much.
Ellen, thank you very much, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I particularly want to thank the activists who have been on the ground speaking up on behalf of human rights globally and particularly in Russia. We thank you for the work that you have done. It's important, and we're making progress. Ellen mentioned the Magnitsky Bill. I know you've talked about that, but it's a series of efforts that have been done in the United States Congress to advance basic human rights. I am proud of the role that the U.S. Helsinki Commission has played in advancing international rights within the OSCE and within the global community. We worked hard on trafficking, a major priority of our commission, and I think we've made progress. My first work in the Helsinki Commission dealt with the Soviet Jews in the Soviet Union and working for a policy that would allow them to emigrate. We most recently worked in getting transparency to deal with corruption. So we are active on the principles of advancing human rights. Why? Because the Helsinki Commission and the Helsinki Final Act recognize that stability in a country is more than their military strength. It also involves their respect for basic human rights and economic freedom. The United States has a direct interest in the stability of other countries. It's important for us not only on bilateral relations, but also on stability within regions that become critically important. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, we have seen great advancements in countries that were dominated by the former Soviet Union, and we have celebrated those advancements. We celebrated those advancements in Russia, as we saw progress being made with great hope. But within the last several years, we've seen in Russia and in other countries that were dominated by the Soviet Union trends that are not helpful, moving in the wrong direction. Under the Helsinki Final Act, each signatory nation has agreed not only to the principles of Helsinki, but also to the right of any other country to challenge what that country is doing. And that's what the Helsinki Commission does. That's what I did. That's what the United States Congress has done. We have said, look, no country is perfect. Every country can improve. I take pride in the fact that I have been critical of actions within the United States when I think it violates the principles of Helsinki. But in Russia's case, some of their recent conduct is just difficult to understand. I know the first panel dealt with that, and then this panel is now going to deal with what should our response be? What is the appropriate response? Well, you have seen the documentation of the abuses. Our objective is simple. Our objective is not to ban Russians from visiting the United States or using our banking system. That's not our objective. Our objective is to have the rule of law complied with within Russia. It's to get Russia to do what's right for its citizens. And during the entire debate on Magnitsky, some of the best testimony came from people in Russia saying to me that Russia can do better. They can do much better. So our objective is to get change in Russia. Now, the Magnitsky bill dealt with the fruits of the corruption. Those that were involved in the tragedy concerning Sergei Magnitsky, they wanted to visit other countries, and they wanted their corrupt dollars, their corrupt money in something other than rubles, in dollars or euros. So we blocked that, and we expect that the implementation of our laws will make that clear. We also want the list to be public because we want people to know. We want people to understand what this is all about. But we need help. We want the Magnitsky standards to be global. It shouldn't just apply to one country, it should apply globally. And we want other countries to follow the lead of the United States as it relates to those that were responsible for the tragedy against Mr. Magnitsky, particularly our friends in Europe. So as you continue your work, we hope that you will help us in promoting the basic human rights in which the Magnitsky Act is really all about. I want to thank Freedom House for the work that you've done over the years to promote basic freedom. The Foreign Policy Initiative and the Institute for Modern Russia. We thank you for all bringing together such a large group today. This is an impressive gathering. And I can tell you that we will be following the work that is done by these panels. We want to see democratic institutions of a fairly elected legislature in Russia. We want to see an independent judiciary in Russia. We want to see free press in Russia and in all countries. And with your help, we think we can get progress in reaching those goals. The one point I hope we will all agree is that we will not be stopped from our work. We will not be persuaded to do something different because of the irrational actions in response to the Magnitsky bill. This Congress is going to speak for international rights for adoption, and we're going to speak for international rights for a fair system. Both are important, and we will not compromise one for the other. So I appreciate again your attention here today, and I can assure you that we will want to continue to work in partnership. We can't do this alone. We need your help. And you really are our heroes. You are the people that are on the front lines. We understand that. I'm proud of the work of the United States Congress. I'm proud of the work of the United States Helsinki Commission. And we're proud of the partners that we have that are in this room. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. There's no more important person than him to start off our panel on should the West respond and how. You have the biographies of our speakers that list their incredible accomplishments. I will just briefly introduce them. We're going to start with Ms. Christina Oiland, elected to the European Parliament in 2009, and she quickly became a leading voice on Russia. Before which she had a distinguished career in Estonian politics. Then we'll move on to Edward McMillan-Scott, who is the European Parliament's Vice President for Democracy and Human Rights since 2004, and has a wide range of interests, including Tibet and Egypt, I understand. And then we will end with Lilia Shevtsova, a political scientist and a prolific author who's also a friend, who you hear often at great length on NPR every time there's a development in Russia. So I'm going to just generally open up with the first part of our panel discussion question, should the West respond, and let each of you take a shot at that, and we'll see how that goes, and then you can either go right into if so, how, or develop it however you'd like. But thank you, and we'll start with Ms. Oiland.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and let me say that I'm really honored and pleased to be here again. since last summer, when we had another joint meeting together with the FreedomHouse hearing on the political situation in Russian Federation. Well, I tried to be very brief in my introductory remarks, and of course I would be very happy to respond to your questions. So what should we do? What should we do over what we see happening in Russia, especially after the last 2 years? The year 2011 with the parliamentary elections, which were not free and fair. The last year, 2012, with the presidential elections, followed by politically motivated processes after the Bolotnaya protests. A lot of political opposition members were arrested. Now the trials are going on. 14 people are imprisoned already, and more to be followed probably. We have witnessed the Pussy Riot case last year. Well, the accession of Russia to the WTO, where again we see they don't implement their international commitments, and so on, so on. It's simply it's simply going worse, put it very directly, and the question is how the West can respond, in which way. I'm very happy and I congratulate the United States of America that they adopted the Magnitsky Act, and I personally hope that Europe will follow to do something similar, to use the targeted sanctions against those people who are violating human rights, who are violating the basic freedoms, or who are involved in corruption, and who are involved in bringing the black money to the European Union. So the question is, yes, how to do it, how to react it, and here I think the one of the principal question is that how much United States of America and Europe are able to work together in this. Because I think for me it's very much a transatlantic approach, and we should coordinate our policies very, very closely in order to be effective at the end of the day responding to Kremlin's regime. And secondly, what I would like to say, that when we are reacting what we see in Russia, then one thing must be very clear. We don't act against Russia. We don't act against Russian people. But we are addressing the problems what we see with the Putin's regime. And therefore, exactly these targeted sanctions, what United States is now going to implement soon, are one of the best ways how to address the problems what we see in Russia. So, in a way, we should act in favor, supporting Russian political opposition and civil society in this situation. The idea to relaunch the Helsinki process, what the Helsinki Committee's movements, what was launched in 1975, that is one very concrete response initiative from Europe, from my own political group. Mr. Verhofstadt is here with us. He's a sort of godfather of the idea to relaunch the Helsinki movement, just to support the activities of civil society in Russian Federation and the political opposition, to support them from the West, from the democratic West. And I think that this is something very concrete and very much needed. The knowledge in Russia among civil society of the fact that the West has not forgotten them, that the West is supporting them in this situation where Kremlin regime has driven this country, these people. I think this is very important. I'm coming myself from Estonia, which was occupied 50 years by the Soviet Union. And for us in that time during the occupation, during the time of the Soviet Union, it was absolutely vital to know that the United States of America never recognized the occupation, but also for our people who fought in that time to re-establish the independence of Estonia. For them, it was also very, very important that the Helsinki Committee movement around the democratic West was existing, and the support was crucial. So I'm very sorry that Russia is today driving so much back and so fast back to the history where they have been already violating their own constitution, violating their obligations in the international organizations, and just taking away the perspective of young people living in Russia to enjoy the free and democratic country. It's pity, and therefore we need to, as a Western democratic community, we should be ready to support those people who need us today in Russian Federation. Thank you.
So it's a great pleasure to be here, and also to follow my political colleagues, the leader of our political group, Guy Verhofstadt, and Christina Ojuland, who incidentally was Estonia's foreign minister. My job as Vice President of the European Parliament, covering democracy and human rights, and in addition, the Sakharov Prize Network, is to try and uphold within the House and externally the values that are contained in the treaties which set up the European Union. Because among the priorities in foreign policy, the number one priority, in fact, is the promotion of human rights and democracy worldwide. And so that is the underlying theme of the European Parliament's approach to countries like Russia. In fact, I first visited Russia back in 1970. I got arrested in what was then called Leningrad for visiting places of religion. I'm not personally religious, but I've always been concerned about totalitarianism and the effect it has on religions, whether it's in Russia yet then or China today. And I was never arrested since, as a matter of fact. But it did create an impression on me of a very brutal power, as it then was. So it was with enormous pleasure that I watched the change taking place towards 1989 and onwards. And among the people I met at the time were some of the heroes of that process, including Yelena Bonner, sadly died last year, and her daughter is a US citizen. And I raise this because next year is the 25th anniversary of the founding by the European Parliament of the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Expression. This is awarded every year, and it's our number one political activity, if you like, focused on the outside world. Whether it's a Cuban winner or a Chinese winner, it's always an event for the European Parliament. And next year we'll be celebrating it in particular style, as I say, the 25th anniversary of its founding. And I hope that we could actually work rather more closely with the US Congress than perhaps beforehand. And in celebrating our award, have some sort of joint conference or event with the US Congress. The NGOs based here in Washington, like FreedomHouse, with whom I'm very familiar, or the National Endowment for Democracy, which I visited earlier today, have been extremely vigorous in keeping the flag of freedom, democracy, and human rights flying around the world. But it is right that we should focus on Russia today because of the decline in the democratic process. And in the European Parliament, I should draw your attention to the arrival in 2004 of members of the European Parliament from what we call the new democracies, that is to say Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and others. And the atmosphere towards Russia has changed from being somewhat tolerant to being increasingly critical. And our last resolution on Russia actually stated in terms our concerns about ongoing intimidation, harassment, arrests of representatives of opposition forces and NGOs, the recent adoption of the laws on NGO financing and the right of assembly, the law on defamation and the law imposing internet restrictions, as well as the increasing pressure being exerted on the free and independent media and on minorities with respect to sexual orientation and religious belief, which are all resulting in a further degradation of the situation regarding human rights and democratic principles in Russia. So the question posed by this seminar is, should the West respond and how? And I want to make some definition now of how difficult it is for the European Union to respond as clearly and as critically as some may wish. And it is because, with 27 member states and more than 20 official languages, it is quite difficult to arrive at a position where we speak, as it were, with one voice without sinking to the lowest common denominator. And I can remember at a conference, a previous conference in this series in Moscow, Sergei Kovalyov criticizing very vigorously the way in which the European Union's official spokesman, Cathy Ashton, who is the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, as it were, does not deal with the things that concern most people about Russia today. And it is because she has to work, as it were, with a committee framework. So when we deal with the negotiations ongoing for a partnership and cooperation agreement with Russia, I think there's a recognition that it will be quite difficult to get it through at the present time, especially because now the European Parliament has to approve the partnership and cooperation agreement under our new powers under the Lisbon Treaty. And that is because there are concerns about agriculture, there are concerns about the environment, there are concerns about energy policy, there are concerns, of course, about the process of decline in Russia's democracy and human rights. And when the OSCE, an organization of which the United States is also a part, defines the recent elections in Russia as not free and fair, then you can begin to understand why it is not easy to find a good relationship with the current regime. And the Magnitsky process is maybe a case in point of the difficulty of arriving at a consensus, because as the senator sought to encourage other European countries, and indeed Christina followed this up, at the moment what has actually happened is that the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Sweden and Poland, their parliaments have passed resolutions asking their governments to act. Others are preparing such a resolution, but that's a very long step from actual decisions. And I would just point out that the European Parliament itself adopted a resolution, again calling on the EU to introduce restrictive legislation, calling for establishing a common list of officials responsible for the death of Sergei Magnitsky, for the subsequent judicial cover-up, and for the ongoing and sustained harassment of his mother and widow, to impose and implement an EU-wide visa ban on these officials, and to freeze any financial assets they or their immediate family may hold inside the European Union, and so on. So the process is underway, but it is not going to be easy to get the EU as a whole to agree any form of sanctions, although we must keep up the pressure. And I would answer in 3 words how the West should respond, and in particular the European Union. After all, Russia is a neighbor of ours on our continent. And these words are vigilance, candor, and conditionality. Russia cannot be allowed, or at least the Putin regime cannot be allowed, to continue with impunity to behave as if the rest of the world did not exist. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Lilia, please.
Thank you. Ellen, thank you. Well, it's a great privilege and fun to be here, to be part of this panel, and to be part of this event. Frankly speaking, I wanted to skip over the first part of the question, should the West respond? Because it was so natural for us that, of course, the West should respond to what is happening in Russia, in Ukraine, in Belarus, and other countries. But then I thought that it will be unfair to huge foreign policy community in America and in other European countries, to politicians, to experts, to lobbyists who believe that there is still place in the West for the so-called patient diplomacy. This is the term coined by a very respected guy, Senator Hart, recently in New York Times. Really, the West could just continue to do what David Kramer so hates the West to do, continue to follow the old rules of the game based on the linkage between foreign policy and domestic developments. The West should and could still be able to get some dividends from its transactional cooperation with Moscow on Iran, on Afghan transit, on nuclear security, on trade and investments. But we have to state clear, very nasty and raw truth. Under what condition this kind of Western transactional cooperation with Moscow could be effective? Only on the Kremlin terms. And what are the terms? You can read any Russian and not only Russian newspaper, because these terms have been frequently and unequivocally stated, underlined, stressed, and highlighted. And the terms are: no preaching on democracy, stop lecturing us, no meddling inside of the country and outside of Russia. Forget about Magnitsky Act, just forget the word Magnitsky, and allow to create favorable environment for what Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the first to define export of the Russian corruption into the West. So we would like to be inside of the West, outside of the West, against the West, and sucking on the West. If you agree to these terms, the Kremlin will continue transactional cooperation like it has been doing until recently. But the question is, could this kind of transactional cooperation be sustainable and effective? And just the recent history, the failure of Reset and the failure of the European Partnership for Modernization has demonstrated that no, there are no guarantees that this kind of dialogue within this kind of framework could be effective or sustainable. Why? Simply because the Kremlin has started, to look for the ways of survival, just trying to deter the West as the hostile civilization. And, the West cannot guarantee, it cannot hope that cooperation with a state that is hostile, that is deterring you, could be long, effective, or successful. It will end only, firstly, in undermining our hopes, and secondly, in undermining the Western civilization. And finally, let me, now from being fair, to move to the question what the West could do. I would rephrase the question because, I don't think that, I'm in a position to give any kind of recommendation and advice to the West. I would rephrase it in a different way. What we, Russians, civil society, political opposition, intellectuals, independent experts that I'm representing here, what we could expect from the West that could make, our exit solution faster or less painful. Well, several points. Firstly, recognize the fact that there is no Russia. There is no one Russia. It never was. There are at least two Russias. There is Russia of the Kremlin and political establishment, and there is Russia of civil society, of political opposition that is sitting here, and the West has to formulate, finally, dual-track policy towards the Kremlin Russia and towards our Russia. Secondly, just, get rid of the myth that we are much worse than Romanians, Poles, Hungarians, Mongolians, that we are not ready as a society for democracy. I don't think that we represent, an inferior species, and we've been trying during the last year to prove it. Thirdly, don't isolate neither our civil society Russia nor the Kremlin Russia. Even during the times of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the West found areas for cooperation. But cooperating on energy security, on nuclear, or whatever regional security, don't pretend that this is strategic partnership or cooperation, because strategic dialogue is possible only on one basis, on the basis of convergence of values. Finally, Lyudmila Mikhailovna Alexeyeva was here. I would argue that, she spoke during the previous panel. I would argue that the old panel of democracy promotion in Russia, like lecturing us how to build parties or parliament, it's obsolete. But our civil society, our civil initiatives and projects need another way to get support and to get respect. And finally, the principle of conditionality. And here, Christina and Guy already have elaborated on that. The most effective way to influence not the Russian society, but the Russian political elite and the Russian corrupted state is to follow the principle. You want the benefits of the Western society, you behave at home. And Magnitsky law is a breakthrough in the whole model of impacting, influencing the authoritarian society. And finally, I don't think that any agenda, any policy on the part of the West will be effective without your common agenda that people during the previous panel and my colleagues here have been elaborating. And the most important thing, I don't think that we Russians need any kind of philanthropy, any kind of altruism from the West. And Lyudmila Alexeyeva was absolutely right, and she, gave the message that we are feeling and trying to send, during all these venues. We believe that the West needs normative value, normative approach, reclaiming the principles just as much as we in Russia would like to have it. And I would argue that Russia and China, yes, China, the rising power, these two countries apparently will be the challenges of the 21st century. And these challenges will be a test for you folks and for the Western society, for the principles, for values, and for your mission in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilia. We have some time. We'll go to questions from the audience in a few minutes, but I'm going to take my opportunity to ask a few questions, perhaps, for you to join in on. I'm curious, there's been virtually no mention of the Obama administration throughout this afternoon. Do we need a different attitude in leadership from the Obama administration towards the Russian authorities? And also on another related point, do we need leadership for Europe to join in this important endeavor of enacting Magnitsky-like legislation or undertaking other efforts like that?
Yes, well, sorry. Well, this is a cold weather here in Washington.
For an Estonian?
Even for me. Yes, actually, what comes to US policy vis-à-vis Russia, then I must say that number of my colleagues in Europe, we were expecting from his last speech, what you call it, the annual speech or the State of Union speech, some lines on further plans, how to cooperate with Russia or how to react what we see in Russia. So unfortunately, we did not see it, we did not hear it, and I think that we can say that I regret it that we didn't hear that. But in Europe as well, there are a lot of common concerns in member states what's happening in Russia. But in Europe, it's very, very difficult to expect that we can have a very strong reaction on the EU level, because EU member states, 27 countries, they still are like a national states with their national interests. And this comes to the relations with Russian Federation. Take Cyprus, for example, one of the member states, where a lot of this Russian black money is taken in. There is a lot of interests in Cyprus to support the Kremlin's regime. Russia helped Cyprus when they had these financial difficulties last year. So there are a lot of aspects in almost every country has in Europe their own some arguments or some their own problems why they are so hesitating to come together and to decide upon even this Magnitsky sanctions. European Parliament last year in October adopted by vast majority the recommendation to our governments to introduce the visa sanctions and also the sanctions against the financial assets. European Parliament, where we have 754 people from 27 member countries elected directly, expressed very clearly their political will to introduce the visa sanctions, but as soon it comes to the government level or to the level of our external action service led by Lady Ashton, then it becomes more complicated. But nevertheless, I'm not pessimistic. And I can say that we continue the work in the European Parliament to encourage our member states, governments, national parliaments are more and more coming into the same line. So I would say that this is not totally hopeless. It's not hopeless. And once again, the Magnitsky Act, what was adopted in US, it's not only politically encouraging European countries, but I think it comes very much also in practical terms. We should see the practical terms that if US is going to introduce visa sanctions, for example, against one or another person, it would immediately bring a lot of question marks in Europe, that why then European Union is accepting still those people in our countries, shopping in Paris or just educating their children in London.
Does either of the other panelists have a response about the Obama administration, its potential leadership going forward on these questions?
Well, it's not for me to comment on American foreign policy, but it's a little unfair to say that the State of the Union address didn't contain anything. There was one sentence on democracy and human rights, so it was there, but it didn't mention Russia. But I think there's a certain aversion at the moment to a vigorous foreign policy here, although the Magnitsky Act, in a sense, rather defies that consensus. And I think it's a good thing that the Congress should adopt the Act. And I sincerely hope that the European nations will follow suit. I come, as you probably gather from my voice, from the United Kingdom, and it's a country which is inclined to be fairly adventurous from time to time. And I was the only non-Russian politician to speak at a conference organized by NED in Moscow in 2006 called The Other Russia. And the only other non-Russian or American there was the British ambassador, Tony Branton, who eventually was more or less slung out of Russia, having been involved in a stitched-up spying saga. And so, no, I think when it comes to the difficulties of trying to establish a transatlantic response to Russia, there is a genuine problem on our side, and that is the 27 countries with differing traditions and differing interests. And the near impossibility for poor Cathy Ashton to try and drag these countries together, as Christina has said. But it should not stop the effort. And that is why some of us feel quite vigorous and critical of the way in which this consensus building is taking such a long time. But conditionality, to come back to Lilia's earlier point, is absolutely fundamental. We need to find those areas where we can twist and tweak the Putin regime and make it absolutely clear that this sort of continued behavior will not actually, in the end, reward them. And it is extremely difficult when the means of getting at a large Russian population is extremely hard. And the banishing of NGOs is part of a process which I fear is likely to continue unless we continue to make a fuss. And rightly, the alignment of China and Russia has been identified in this appalling organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Council. I spoke at a conference in Petersburg of that organization. I've never felt quite as cynical about politics as I felt that day.
Helen allows me to be even more reckless. You know, my hunch is that when I'm watching Washington and other European foreign policy efforts regarding Russia, I have a hunch that, firstly, maybe the governments do not understand that they have failed in their policies towards Russia, or maybe they do understand, because looking at Chancellor Merkel, well, she's such a smart woman. Of course, she understands a lot. Maybe they are not able to admit their failures. But here I pencil down 3 sentences that apparently will demonstrate my view of the Western foreign policy towards Russia. Firstly, this foreign policy in most countries follows the principle, let's pretend. Secondly, the process is everything, the goal is nothing. And you were so interested about our perception of Obama. Apparently, you know, the guy who coined the phrase leading from behind is the most perfect in defining the current administration attitude towards Russia. Even if Americans ignore Moscow, this will be a present for Putin.
Well, I think we are ready for questions. Let's see a few hands. Ariel Cohen.
Good afternoon, Ariel Cohen, the Heritage Foundation. Europe is a great market for Russia and the market for natural gas. We in this country now are in the midst or in the beginning of what is some call the shale gale, the increase in production and hopefully exports of shale gas through LNG, liquid natural gas. There's also plenty of LNG, liquid natural gas, coming from other places, including offshore Africa, west and now east, including Qatar and other places. To what extent the rethinking of the European energy policy may contribute to diversification of your gas imports and therefore the change in the balance of imports of that important commodity from Russia? Thank you.
Who'd like to try that? Well, you can all say no, I suppose.
I can give you a factual answer, which is that the responsibility for energy security is now one of the new policies under the Lisbon Treaty, which governs the activities of the European Union. Of course, the dilemma is highlighted by Lily's answer to the earlier point about, for example, the position of Germany, which has a very the position is rather difficult to define. Former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, I believe, is still working for Russian energy interests. And, but on the other hand, the dependency of many European countries on Russian energy is something we cannot ignore. It is power politics. And we have to be very aware of the different interests. But energy is not my baby.
Neither mine.
Well, I just can add perhaps that, of course, Europe has a very clear and strong priority to become less dependent of Russian gas and oil. This is the basis. This is a common agreement, common understanding. Of course, it takes years. It takes time to look for alternative energy resources, starting from rethinking our own energy production, going more into the green energy. There is a target that by 2020 Europe should produce itself 20% of the green energy. Then what comes to the shale gas, then, well, a lot of new resources are found also in the EU territory, like in Poland, for example. Or take Ukraine, in Ukraine as well. Ukraine, well, not a member, of course, of the European Union, but last year in Ukraine, with the cooperation of the United States, there has been a lot of research of the shale gas, and they are also looking towards becoming less dependent of Russian gas and oil. But if let's predict that in a few years Ukraine will be able to produce, to start the production, then also Europe will have another source of energy to buy it from Ukraine, and definitely European Union is looking for new partners to become less dependent of one of the provider, well, Azerbaijan, and then there are some other new energy partners.
I have a very quick question. Are there any prospects for visas for a new refugee program, political refugees from Russia, like what we had back in the 70s for the Russian Jews? I think it's now a good time to start it again here in the United States and in Europe.
You are talking about us already, yeah?
What?
I don't know, but would either any of you like to say, is there anything going on in your countries or in the European Parliament on that point?
I think in general, the approach taken by European Union countries is very tolerant of people who are held to be under threat at home. And we have a policy now on immigration generally, but each member state has its own discretion to allow the settlement of people who are held to be at risk. So I don't think there's any particular need to enhance that approach. Asylum is asylum.
More questions? This gentleman. Yes, you.
Thank you. George Mihais from Phoenix Partnership. Two quick questions. Forgive me the expression. There seems to be much concern in America about the increasing Putinization, I apologize, of European countries, in particular the new members. in Central and Eastern Europe. Some of the major parties, members of European Parliament, specifically ALDE, seems to have sponsored such a non-protection of rule of law in those countries. This is first question. Second question, is there any agreement between European Parliament and the Congress of the United States regarding education, middle school, high school in Europe and America?
First, George, I'm going to answer your first question because you made a suggestion that somehow the ALDE group, which is the liberal group in the European Parliament, to which I belong, Guy belongs, and Christina belongs, in some way organizing conferences aimed at the non-protection of the rule of law. On the contrary, we're very much in favor of the protection of the rule of law and of democracy and of human rights. That's what the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe actually stands for. I think you will find that we're the most vigorous group, most active group, and in our leader, Guy Verhofstadt, we have a person who is always keen to jump in and get involved. And I speak as someone who, I went to Egypt at the end of the revolution. Guy Verhofstadt came the following week. And we have since then built a network of Arab countries for freedom. That's the way we work.
Well, I'm not really very sure, but if I understood you correctly, what you meant by the Putinization of the Central and Eastern European countries. Well, this is, yes, this is true that Kremlin's regime is very keen to grow its or her influence over the neighboring countries. And not only Ukraine, not only Moldova, Belarus, but also even the Baltic countries, I should say, despite of the fact that we are members of the European Union, despite of the fact that we are members of NATO. Still, this could be another longer discussion, and I don't have time for this, but this Kremlin regime is really trying to influence the political environment also in Baltic states. Not speaking about trying to taking Ukraine to the customs union with Kazakhstan and Belarus, or to the Eurasian Union, what looks a little bit like re-establishing the Soviet Union in the sense of members whom they would like to see there in this Eurasian Union. So the ambition, yes, to get an influence in their, as they call, near neighborhood. This is true, and we understand it very well. We stand against of this. Of course, we just don't agree with this kind of approach, and of course we work very closely as comes to the Baltic countries. Of course we work very closely together with our European Union partners, and we are very careful with these attempts, what we can see from Kremlin. And well, speaking about this rule of law and then paying attention on that, then I didn't say in the beginning, but last year, 2012, I can call it as a sort of a year of Russia in the European Parliament, as long we adopted 6 resolutions addressing all different kind of concerns what the Parliament has, starting from the violations of the electoral laws, or just ending up with the questions of justice and rule of law. And plus this recommendation on Magnitsky. And this year again, we are now planning this summer to have another hearing on the political prisoners, because this is one growing concern when we see that more and more political opposition is suppressed, imprisoned, and well, Mr. Khodorkovsky will have this year already 10 years anniversary in prison. There are a number of plans what are linked with the issues of rule of law and justice in Russia. Thank you.
Conceivably, one more question. Let me see I can't even see who's here. So this lady right here, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Laure Mandeville. I'm the bureau chief of the French daily newspaper Le Figaro. I was wondering whether the European delegates here could give us a little course of European geopolitics, internal geopolitics, and tell us which countries, apart from Cyprus, which has been mentioned here, are blocking the adoption of the Magnitsky Act. Thank you.
Well, I did not say that Cyprus or some parties directly blocking it. But the question, for example, I just explain you. Last year, you know that the European Union has the system of the presidencies. The countries, every member country has the presidency of the Union for a half a year. Last half a year, Cyprus had the European Union's presidency. And when the president of Cyprus was addressing to the European Parliament, I asked the question, for example, about supporting to take the Magnitsky issue into the Council's agenda. And there was no response in public debate on my question. So it shows that there is some sort of non-readiness to speak about it, to cooperate in this question.
Can I just add a thought to our French colleague? She won't mind me reminding you of the audience of the story of the British ambassador some 150 years ago, who was woken in the middle of the night by his valet, who said, "Your Excellency, I have grave news. During the night, the French ambassador has died." And the British ambassador said, "I wonder why he did that." Now, I would ask you what Monsieur Hollande, the French president, was doing in Moscow last week, and what it had to do with human rights and democracy.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We just have a little bit of business left, and we'll have our event closed by Pablo Khodorkovsky, and I welcome him too.
Thank you all. Just to recap, I'll try to be very brief. I think today we have seen a number of issues outlined by our distinguished panelists and the guests, namely Congressman McGovern and Senator Cardin, that have prompted the idea for this discussion. Do we in fact have a new approach, or will it be business as usual in the coming years in the foreign policy between US, the European Union, and Russia? The issues that face Russia today are on one side very simple, on the other side are indicative of very complex tendencies in both the government and the society. The government has chosen the path of repression tactics in suppressing the opposition, revoking even more civil freedoms, further stifling the civil society, making it more difficult than ever for the NGOs to function and carry out the very important work that has in turn actually helped the reemergence of the civil society that we see today formulating these new demands for the reforms of our current government. On the other hand, we also see the legislative changes that are aimed at the very same goals of further reducing the freedoms of my fellow citizens of Russia. These goals, to destroy the human rights community, to make it more difficult for our country to advance both politically and as a society, are actually having the very opposite effect. The society as a whole and the representatives that are working tirelessly to make Russia a freer, fairer place are engaging with the counterparties and are formulating the very solutions that we see outlined today. The congressional activism that we have seen in the latest couple of years has really outlined the path of engagement and has presented the new tool set that the foreign governments have now at their disposal, expanded tool set that will allow them to really formulate this partnership with the Russian Federation that will be both productive and long-term, that will lead to long-term stability. So, what are the underlying reasons for this? I think it's very important for us today to close with the understanding of why this new tendency is going to be long-lasting. And I think that finally, after a number of years, many different parties to the bilateral relations have vested interests in its continued perpetual success. We have always understood that human rights as a cornerstone of stability has the potential to actually be that everlasting approach to the society and to maintaining the democratic values that will long survive any other efforts. And this strategy has finally garnered the widespread support, not only of the NGOs, but also of the governments. And I think what I'd like to close with us today is that now that we have seen the sort of activism and the willingness to bring forth these changes, it is very important to demand and expect the same type of commitment from the executive powers across both the United States and Europe that will help foster these stable, productive, long-term relationships between our countries that will be based on the very fundamental respect for the human rights. I'd like to also thank Christina for bringing up the very important, for me personally, anniversary that is coming this year. October will mark the 10th year of my father's imprisonment. And this is my vested interest. This is why I personally care and continue to engage as many people as I can to help bring my country and our society into the next phase of the relationship with the rest of the world and advance the democratic values that I believe the majority of Russian citizens have strong adherence to. They just need a little bit of help. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists. I'd like to thank our guests. I'd like to thank the audience for their engagement, for coming here today. And I would like to thank the Foreign Policy Initiative and the Freedom House for co-hosting the event today. I hope that this will, in turn, lead to a very decisive and long-lasting result in the much better, much stable, and much more democratic future for Russia. Thank you.